The morning sun cut across the barbed wire like a surgical blade, illuminating the dust rising from Silas Thorne's worn boots. He didn't hear the cruiser roll up, he only heard the sharp, metallic click of a sidearm being unholstered. When Sheriff Miller stepped out, his uniform crisp and devoid of the grime that coated Silas's overalls, the air in the valley seemed to solidify. It wasn't just a trespassing charge, it was a theater of power, a staged performance meant to break a man who had held this land for 50 years. Within seconds, cuffs were ratcheting shut, metal biting into weathered skin, while the silence of the farm screamed of something far more sinister than a boundary dispute. The scene was, by all accounts, a masterclass in intimidation. Silas, a man whose hands were mapped with the scars of 1,000 harvests, didn't fight back. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes, a mixture of profound exhaustion and a cold, calcified defiance, was more dangerous than any weapon. The sheriff, a man whose career had been fueled by political donations from industrial developers, barked orders that barely masked a trembling hand. To the outside observer, this was a routine arrest, an elderly man refusing to vacate a plot of land slated for a new corporate logistics hub. But for those who knew the history of the county, this was the final move in a long-standing game of chess. The legal machinery had been turning against Silas for months. Every permit he filed, every tax exemption he claimed, and every water right he exercised was met with a bureaucratic wall. It was a war of attrition. The sheriff didn't want the land, he wanted the submission. He wanted to parade Silas through the town square to show the remaining holdouts that even the most stubborn roots could be torn up by the right machinery. As the patrol car pulled away, leaving a plume of choking red dust in its wake, the silence of the farm was replaced by the mechanical hum of encroaching bulldozers that sat idling at the edge of the lot, waiting for the signal. But there was a variable no one had calculated. Silas wasn't just a farmer, he was the keeper of the ledgers. For decades, he had kept meticulous records of every handshake deal, every illegal favor, and every backroom promise made by the county's elite. He knew where the lines were drawn, and he knew who had moved the markers. The arrest was supposed to be the silence, but instead, it became the spark. By locking him in a cell, the sheriff had inadvertently forced the one man who had nothing left to lose into the position of a whistleblower. As Silas sat in the sterile, fluorescent glare of the precinct-holding cell, he closed his eyes and began to recite dates, names, and dollar amounts. He was building a defense that transcended property law. He was building an indictment. The sheriff stood outside the glass, watching him with a predatory curiosity, unaware that the man he had just arrested was drafting a narrative that would eventually reach the steps of the state attorney's office. The town, meanwhile, watched the news cycle begin, wondering why a simple land dispute had necessitated a tactical squad and a midnight transport. The tension in the air wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about the fear of what Silas might say once he was granted his one phone call. And in that, the sheriff had made his first, and final, mistake. The paperwork on Sheriff Miller's desk was as thick as a tombstone, and every page represented a deliberate fracture in the law. To understand why an 80-year-old farmer was currently sitting in a holding cell, one had to look at the legal web that had been spun around the Thorne property. This wasn't just a simple eminent domain grab, it was a sophisticated, multi-layered scheme involving shell companies, rezoning loopholes. And the sheriff whose primary job had become protecting private interests rather than upholding the public oath. The development company, Apex Horizon, had been circling the property for 3 years. They didn't want the land for the soil, they wanted the mineral rights and the proximity to the new interstate exchange. Silas Thorne had become an immovable object in a world that demanded fluidity. The official narrative pushed by the sheriff's department was that Silas had become mentally unstable and a danger to local infrastructure. It was a classic character assassination, designed to strip away sympathy before the physical eviction even occurred. They had cited a municipal code from the 1950s that allowed the county to declare a property a public hazard if maintenance wasn't up to current commercial standards. Of course, the standard was set so high that no working farm could possibly meet it. It was a trap, a snare set by lawyers in glass offices who had never stepped foot in a muddy field. The reality, however, was far more mundane and brutal. The sheriff had been receiving consulting fees through a series of intermediaries, masked as donations to a local youth athletic program. These funds allowed Miller to upgrade his precinct's fleet and his own lifestyle. In return, he served as the blunt instrument of the developer's will. Whenever a neighbor considered selling, Miller would arrive, badge gleaming, to imply that the person's tax assessments might suddenly skyrocket or their water usage might be flagged for a surprise audit. It was a local reign of terror disguised as public service. The townspeople knew, but they remained silent. They had bills to pay and families to protect, and in a county where the sheriff was the ultimate arbiter of justice, silence was the safest currency. Silas, however, had stopped using that currency years ago. When he was first approached by the developers, they offered him a sum that would have retired him in comfort. He refused without looking at the check. He didn't refuse because of greed, he refused because he understood the land in a way these men could not. He knew the aquifers underneath the valley, and he knew that the development would poison the very water source that sustained the neighboring 3 towns. He wasn't holding on to the land for himself, he was holding on to it as a dam against the toxicity that would follow. The legal web tightened when the sheriff filed for a temporary restraining order, claiming Silas had threatened a surveyor. It was a complete fabrication, a lie manufactured in the same office where they coordinated the land grabs. Silas, having never faced a courtroom, was blindsided. He had spent his life dealing with the rhythms of the earth, not the deceit of the courtroom. When he arrived for his first hearing, he found the opposing counsel had already pre-written the judge's order. The system was rigged, the game was fixed, and the deck was stacked against the old man from the moment he walked through the heavy, mahogany doors. Yet, there was a flaw in the sheriff's design. Miller had assumed that because Silas was old, he was isolated. He didn't know about the secret archive in the barn, the floorboards Silas had pried up years ago to store the letters. These weren't just letters, they were communications from local officials that Silas had intercepted and documented over decades. He had been quietly acting as a private investigator, tracking the rise of the very corruption that was now trying to bury him. He didn't just have evidence of land theft, he had evidence of a decades-long racketeering operation that linked the sheriff to the county commission, the developers, and, most importantly, the state attorney's office. As the second day of his incarceration dragged on, the sheriff felt a strange, nagging anxiety. He had expected Silas to break, to beg for a deal, or to call a public defender who would settle for a plea agreement. Instead, Silas remained unnervingly calm. He sat on his cot, staring at the wall, occasionally jotting notes on a scrap of paper with a stub of a pencil. It was the calm of a man who knew a storm was coming. The sheriff kept pacing the hallway, checking his watch, waiting for the call that would finalize the transfer of the land deed. But the call never came. Instead, his phone buzzed with an alert he dreaded. A courier from the state attorney's office was on his way, and the message attached was encrypted with a level of security that made the sheriff's blood run cold. The arrival of the courier was the first crack in the foundation of the sheriff's carefully constructed reality. The courier, a man in a charcoal suit who looked more like an undertaker than a legal aid, bypassed the front desk entirely. He walked past the deputy who tried to stop him with the kind of absolute, unearned confidence that only comes from being an extension of someone much higher up the food chain. Sheriff Miller met him in the hallway, his face a mask of practiced stoicism, but his eyes were darting toward the holding cells. He knew that whatever was in that leather briefcase, his department's current operational paradigm was about to be forcibly revised. The state attorney, a man whose name was whispered in local politics like a dark incantation, was not known for his interventions in local land disputes. He dealt in high-stakes litigation, state-level corruption investigations, and the kind of long-term political maneuvering that decided who eventually climbed into the governor's seat. For him to take an interest in a small-town farmer was an anomaly that defied every rule of the sheriff's political education. As they retreated into the private office, the atmosphere shifted from the mundane hum of a police station to the suffocating silence of a confession booth. The courier didn't speak, he simply slid a digital tablet across the desk. On the screen was a document that made Miller's stomach drop. It was a scanned copy of an internal email chain, one he had assumed was deleted years ago, detailing the exact flow of funds from the Apex Horizon developers into a blind trust tied to the sheriff's private offshore account. The document was dated, time-stamped, and featured a digital signature that was impossible to forge. It was a roadmap of his corruption. But the most chilling part wasn't the evidence itself, it was the accompanying video file. It showed a high-definition, wide-angle shot of the meeting at the property line from the day of the arrest, captured by a drone that had clearly been hovering just out of sight. The state attorney's voice, played over the speaker, was cold, analytical, and devoid of any human empathy. "Sheriff, you've become a liability. We needed that land cleared, not a public circus. You were tasked with a surgical strike, and instead, you've invited an audit of the entire county infrastructure." The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized, and absolute. The sheriff realized then that he wasn't just being corrected, he was being discarded. He was the piece on the board being sacrificed to protect the queen. The state attorney wasn't calling to save the project, he was calling to contain the fallout before the trail led back to his own office in the capital. The call was a directive, not a negotiation. The sheriff was ordered to release Silas Thorne immediately, drop all charges, and ensure the property was marked as an historic preservation site, effectively killing the development deal overnight. It was a total, humiliating reversal. The sheriff looked at his own reflection in the darkened window of his office and saw a man who had traded his authority for a series of fraudulent paychecks. He realized the irony. The very man he had arrested, the elderly farmer with the calloused hands and the quiet demeanor, had been holding the leash all along. Silas hadn't needed a lawyer because he had been holding the most lethal weapon of all, the truth. But as the sheriff stepped out of his office, his mind raced with a desperate, final plan. If he let Silas go, he had to ensure that the old man never made it to the press. If the evidence reached the public, the sheriff wouldn't just be out of a job, he would be behind bars for life. He signaled to his senior deputy, a man as complicit in the schemes as he was, and gave a sharp, imperceptible nod toward the holding area. The deal with the state attorney was the public face of the situation, but the private reality was something much darker. The sheriff was banking on the idea that the state attorney would be too preoccupied with covering his own tracks to notice one final, tragic accident happening in the holding cell. The dynamic had now shifted into a race against time. Outside, the news trucks were beginning to gather, alerted by an anonymous tip, likely from Silas himself. The town square, once sleepy and indifferent, was beginning to buzz with an electric, nervous energy. People were coming out of their homes, not because they were told to, but because they felt the shift in the air. The sheriff knew he had 30 minutes before the public pressure made it impossible to move, and he had even less time before the state attorney's people arrived to take custody of the evidence. He walked toward the cell block, his hand hovering near his holster, the weight of his own crimes pressing down on him with the force of a landslide. He wasn't just an officer of the law anymore, he was a trapped animal, and he was ready to do whatever it took to keep his secret buried. The atmosphere outside the sheriff's station had transformed into a pressure cooker of public indignation. What started as a few curious onlookers, drawn by the unusual sight of a tactical vehicle parked near a quiet farmhouse, had swelled into a crowd of hundreds. The anonymity of the internet had done its work, the story of the farmer and the sheriff had leaked onto social media platforms, fueled by high-resolution photos of the arrest and speculative, yet chillingly accurate, threads about the land grab schemes. The townspeople, who had lived under the shadow of Miller's intimidation for years, were finally finding their collective voice. It was a ripple effect of defiance that the sheriff had never anticipated, a grassroots awakening that turned his station into the eye of a massive, brewing storm. Inside the station, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. The sheriff's senior deputy paced the back hallway, his movements erratic, his eyes darting toward the front entrance where the cameras were now clustered. The crowd was chanting now, a rhythmic, deep-throated sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the holding area. For a brief moment, the sheriff's resolve wavered. He looked at the heavy steel door of Silas's cell, then at the exits, weighing the consequences of his next move. The state attorney's instruction to let him go was still ringing in his ears, but the fear of what Silas could reveal to those cameras outside was paralyzing. The public outcry was not merely about justice for an elderly man, it was about the reclamation of the town's soul. Signs were appearing in the crowd, some referencing specific land deeds, others naming local officials who had long been suspected of corruption. The legal web was being dismantled in real time, not by a judge's gavel, but by the relentless curiosity of a citizenry that had finally reached its breaking point. Journalists from major regional outlets were elbowing their way to the front, their microphones recording every shout, every insult, and every demand for transparency. The story had gone viral, and the sheriff knew that any attempt to silence it now would be broadcast to the world. Then, the unexpected occurred. A group of local laborers, many of whom had been forced off their own land by the same development firm, began to form a phalanx around the main entrance. They weren't there to riot, they were there to witness. They were the silent witnesses to the theft, and their presence acted as a physical barricade against any further underhanded tactics. The sheriff watched through a security monitor, his breath hitching. He realized that the power dynamic had inverted. He was no longer the one controlling the narrative, he was the subject of an investigation being conducted by the entire community. The fear that had once been his primary tool had boomed back to haunt him, transformed into the terrifying prospect of public accountability. The senior deputy approached, his voice a frantic whisper. "We can't keep him, boss. If we don't open those doors in the next 5 minutes, the state police will be here, and they won't be coming to help us." The realization was absolute. The state attorney's call was not a suggestion, it was an ultimatum. The moment they opened that cell door, the power would shift, and Silas Thorne, a man they had treated like a criminal, would walk out as the symbol of their undoing. The sheriff felt the weight of his badge, which had once felt like armor, now feel like a lead anchor dragging him toward a life of disgrace. He had tried to play the role of a kingmaker, only to find himself the fool in a tragedy of his own making. As the sheriff unlocked the heavy electronic mechanism, the sound echoed through the sterile hallway like a gunshot. He stared into the cell, waiting for the old man to emerge. Silas stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, weary triumph. He didn't look at the sheriff as he walked past, he looked through him. To Silas, the sheriff was no longer a person of consequence, he was just another failed obstacle in the long, complicated history of the land. The crowd outside roared as the doors finally creaked open, a sound that signaled the end of an era. The sheriff stayed in the shadows of the hallway, watching as the man he had tried to break was hoisted up by his neighbors, a hero of a conflict he had never asked to lead, but had won through the simple, unwavering act of standing his ground. The walk from the station exit to the courthouse lawn felt like a pilgrimage through history. Silas Thorne, now surrounded by a sea of sympathetic faces and camera flashes, moved with the measured pace of a man who had seen the cycles of the seasons and knew that every winter eventually yields to spring. Behind him, the sheriff's department was in a state of total collapse. Within an hour of Silas's release, the state attorney, attempting to salvage his own political career, held a televised press conference in the Capitol. He threw the sheriff under the bus with a clinical, detached ruthlessness, announcing an immediate, independent review of the county's land use policies. It was a classic political sacrifice, intended to frame the entire scandal as the result of isolated local misconduct, rather than a systemic rot that reached the highest levels of the state government. But the story didn't end with a press release. The evidence Silas had painstakingly curated, the ledgers, the intercepted emails, and the records of the secret trusts, had already been uploaded to a secure server. Within days, the files were leaked to investigative journalists who were hungry for a narrative that exposed the intersection of corporate greed and local law enforcement. The fallout was instantaneous and devastating. The sheriff was indicted on charges of racketeering, bribery, and civil rights violations. His office was raided, and the documentation they found in the backrooms confirmed every allegation Silas had made. The legal web hadn't just been torn, it had been incinerated. Apex Horizon, the development firm, suffered an even more public humiliation. Faced with overwhelming evidence of illegal land seizure, their stock plummeted. The investors who had once clamored for the project pulled their funding, citing reputational risk. The proposed logistics hub, which was supposed to be the jewel of the county's economic revival, became a graveyard of half-excavated soil and abandoned heavy machinery. The community, finally liberated from the fear of the sheriff's reach, organized a land trust to ensure that the Thorn property, and the neighboring acres, would remain protected in perpetuity. It was a victory for the preservation of the land, but more importantly, it was a victory for the principle of property ownership against the encroachment of unchecked power. Silas himself retreated from the spotlight as quickly as he had been thrust into it. He returned to his farm, where the silence was finally allowed to return to its natural state. He didn't want the media interviews or the accolades of a hero, he simply wanted to tend to his rows and watch the sunset over the valley he had fought so desperately to protect. The town, however, was fundamentally changed. The event had forced a reckoning with the nature of authority. People began to attend town hall meetings, demanding audits and transparency. They had learned the hard way that when the system is allowed to operate in the dark, it will inevitably consume the very people it is supposed to serve. The final verdict was not delivered by a judge, but by the legacy of the incident itself. The Sheriff versus the Farmer became a cautionary tale in political science classrooms across the state, a case study on how individual integrity can disrupt a corrupt institution. It served as a reminder that the law is not synonymous with justice, and that those who hold the power to arrest are not immune to the consequences of their actions. The sheriff eventually went to trial, his once crisp uniform replaced by a prison jumpsuit, and his influence reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the history of the county. He died in anonymity, while the legend of Silas Thorn, the man who wouldn't be moved, grew to represent the enduring strength of the common citizen. As the years passed, the valley flourished. The water remained clean, the land remained productive, and the community grew more resilient. Silas passed away peacefully in his home, looking out over the fields he had saved. He had no heirs, but he left behind something more significant, a document that would protect the land for generations to come. The story of the arrest, the call, and the subsequent collapse of the regime stood as a testament to the power of a single individual to force the gears of justice to turn, even when the entire system is built to crush them. The narrative of the sheriff and the farmer served as a beacon, a signal to all who might face a similar adversary. Truth, when held with enough conviction, is the only force capable of dismantling the most entrenched lies. And in the end, that is all that really matters.